Hi, Krista. Welcome. Welcome. It's so nice to meet you.
You too. Thank you, Krista and Alex. It's such a joy to be here with you and your audience.
Yeah, well, we're excited to jump into the Enneagram and marriage. We've talked about the Enneagram on the podcast before, but we've never specifically talked about it in light of our marital relationships. And so this is going to be so cool, so interesting.
Yes.
And I do consider this a 2.0 conversation. So if people are new to the Enneagram, they may need to go listen to some of our other episodes, which we can link in the show notes, that cover what the Enneagram is and a little more in depth about, why would we want to use the Enneagram as a tool. However, we'll go ahead and just give like a very quick drive by
Yeah.
of the Enneagram.
I love that. Thank you guys. I'm so glad you've introduced this topic before. The Enneagram is a robust personality typing tool. It's similar to the Big Five, which is typing traits, and the Myers-Briggs rather. And it's also extremely helpful in diving a bit deeper and seeing not only the traits, but even some underlying reasons why we might have those traits. And that leads to a lot of compassion in relationships and in marriages. So, if anyone wonders, is the Enneagram pseudoscience? Understand that all personality typing has to do a bit of speculating. So, you do have to ask. You don't want anyone to use it as a fortune telling kind of thing, like, I know you're a this type on Myers Briggs or Enneagram or anything. And always use it with that tentativeness. But once you can really allow yourself to find what your personality type is, you can do nuanced work in your relationships. And that is such a gift to all of us because we're not just general people who are all the exact same. God made each of us very unique. So it's
Mm-hmm.
also beautiful to use whatever we use as far as tools to glorify him and the work he's doing in us. So I love this tool because it gives me a deeper dive with my clients and it gets down to the root of their issues really well. And it's also elegant and sleek in that it's only 9 types versus sort of the bulkier tests that have a lots of configurations. And wait a second, ENFP versus INFJ, what is that? It's just the one type, and it's helpful to just give that to couples to work on.
Hmm. I never thought of it that way. It does kind of simplify things a little bit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, you can go deep, but it's
Hmm.
a little bit simpler to use for managing relationships.
So give just a quick description. And again, like we just want to do a one-liner for each number, but go ahead and give the
Mm,
9 numbers and what
yeah.
their descriptor is.
Okay, perfect. So the type one is known as the improver. They see the details of everything in life. And the type two is known as the giver. For them, there's nothing more important than sharing and giving in relationships. The three is the performer or the achiever. And for them, gloriously demonstrating God's glory, really, in whatever they're doing is their bread and butter. The four is a creative, unique individualist, and they love to go to the depths with others in their artistry. The five is an observer who is excellent at researching and
Mm.
challenging us to innovate. The six is known as the trust builder, the friend befriender, or the person who is otherwise just going to make sure that we are kept safe and secure. And the seven is the enthusiast, the person who loves to share joy, to problem solve, and to keep things positive. The eight is the protector, the defender, somebody who will go to bat for those they love with strength and leadership. And then nine is the peacemaker, the diplomat, the person who is super thoughtful and able to feel everybody's feelings and consider them as even more important than their own. So that's the 9 types.
Yeah, that was a really
Yeah, good job.
good.
Oh, thank
All
you.
right, we're just moving right along, people. Okay,
Thanks.
so and there
Oh,
has been, I just want to do just a quick acknowledgement. There has been a little bit of pushback from some of
yeah.
the Christian community
Mm.
toward the Enneagram in the last year. So that is not the camp that Alex and I sit in, but obviously, else we wouldn't be having you on today. But can
Yeah.
you just give a little bit of your perspective and acknowledgement about that?
Absolutely. I think it's a great question for those who had it because it tells me that you care deeply about where things come from. And yet we don't want to make a genetic fallacy, which would tell us that just because one person we didn't liked something, that thing was bad. So what we would want to do is instead look at each tool to say, did it come from the American Psychological Association? Are they God? Who worked on the Enneagram? Are they God? And where I think people need to land if they want to use this tool, and again, if they want to use it, is, there's going to be imperfect people who are part of developing probably every medical procedure, psychological assessment tool, anything we use, we have to just use with discretion to know, like, how am I using this tool? Am I using it for good in my relationships? And where am I dedicating my work? And for the Enneagram, it's actually a tool that allows us to look at our vices in a way that a lot of other APA types of tools don't do. So it's an invitation actually for Christians and others who want to use it to say, what are the things that I'm struggling with and how can I work on those things? So I really do actually like it for those doing their faith work for that reason. And I appreciate those who want to know, can I use it if I'm a Christian? And I think that answer is yes, because like I said, you don't want to make that genetic fallacy that because one person who is imperfect worked on it. Now, that said, I think that, the Enneagram is not of the occult. It's definitely not anything like astrology. And when people pair that, I try to help them to realize there are some scientific pieces to the Enneagram. There's a lot of testing on it. There's a lot of people who enjoy it as a scientific measure. And I've seen so many marriages changed from it versus sort of this other way people use, like we said, things that are of the occult where there's fortune telling and things like that. It's nothing like that.
Yeah. Well, and just like I'm a disc coach, and that is a tool, it is not from the Bible. It's something that people have created, and there are scientific measures around it. And it is a tool at the end of the day. It is not something we worship. It is not something that we that we hold as holy in any way. It is simply a tool to help us in relationships and to be more self-aware and to help get along with others better so that we can bring more glory to God. So that really is, and that is really how we're approaching this today, is this is a tool to help you get better in your marital relationship so that you and your marriage can bring more glory to God.
Yes.
So on that note, let's dive in. And I really appreciated what you said about that. So thank you. So we had Suzanne Stabile on our podcast, and she once said in one of those interviews that there aren't certain types who are more compatible than others on the Enneagram. So for example, the 1 pairs best with the 7, or the 9 pairs best with the 5. So she said that's really not true, that any types can be compatible. But I still want to ask the question, are there certain types that are more compatible than others? Because you're the specialist on Enneagram and marriage.
Oh, thank you guys. I will really echo the laughter of there's going to be types that appear to be easier on the surface and may even be a bit easier at times because they might be, for instance, 2 withdrawing types who don't talk about things, or 2 types that are like, okay, we're, super compatible, but everyone has conflict at the end of the day. And when we're healthy and we have our open relationship window of tolerance, we're getting our sleep, in other words, our rest, our healthy rhythms, our fitness, we're going to thrive better no matter what type we are. And every pairing has that conflict because actually conflict by definition is a perceived lack of compatibility. So we have to have conflict. We have to have moments of incompatibility. And thankfully, with great tools, we can find our way back to compatibility. And that's where I like to work with couples is, yes, you're going to have conflict. That's normal. You're humans in and outside of your Enneagram type. And also, yes, you can truly find a way through as we learn how to, like you said earlier, just have compassion on people that are different from us.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to talk about this, and I think our listeners are too. It's been really helpful in our marriage to understand each other better, and it takes some of that personal, why are you acting that way towards me, away, and makes it kind of this external thing that we can talk about, that you are behaving this way because you have this tendency that's connected to your type, rather than you are just behaving this way towards me because we're having a conflict.
Yes.
I mean, there's just that externalizing that's helpful. I'm
Yes.
curious, how often do two people of the same type end up together in a marriage?
It's not that often. It's the least often of all the possible pairing types for you to end
Okay.
up with somebody who is your type. Now, I know that there are wonderful people who do have that. I know Kayla Craig, the author of Every
Mhm.
Season Sacred, is at 8, married to an 8, but they
Oh.
have, for instance, different instincts. And we might get into that later today, but that's a huge piece to know if you're self-preserving or social or more sexual in your wiring. So it's so fun to hear how people might even also use the term wings to describe their differences a bit too. And I think she said they may have different wings where she's an 8, but she has some 7 traits because that's the type right next to her. That's her wing. Or she, he's an 8, but he's a 9 wing. So I see a little bit of that. But again, out of the 45 possible pairings, that is the least likelihood is that you would find somebody exactly like you, because we tend to choose people who will challenge us and build us a bigger, more expansive way to survive in general. And you can even hear how they did that too, as they had different instincts.
Okay, well, let's talk about the instincts because I think let's go
Yay.
ahead and
Yeah.
describe what those are. Because I think a lot of people who even maybe know their Enneagram number and know what number they identify with, they don't
Mm.
know that.
This is my favorite part of the Enneagram, and it's someplace I can work with my couples a lot sooner. In fact, already today, before our time together, it was a great topic for one of my clients. And the instincts are basically looking at your deepest survival wiring. Whereas when we think of personality, we think of the forefront of our brain and that frontal lobe. When we think about the instincts, we think about what developed first when we were babies, and it was that brainstem. And this is where our instincts lie. And every human has all 3 instincts and even subsects of those instincts. But the big 3 here are the self-preserving instinct to take care of you and your family with security measures, the sexual drive or instinct or desire to create together and to merge and to attract. And then that last instinct, which is the social dynamic for social connections and purpose. And this goes right along with Erikson's stages of psychosocial development, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It's just another way of saying we have to feel safe before we can develop relationally and as a society. So many people feel very attached to one of these areas more than others. They say, oh, I'm much more self-preserving than I am sexual or social. And others will say, oh, no, I lead with that intense sexual one-to-one sort of desire to really have deep conversations. And then others say, oh, no, I'm social first. And I really love to influence my world. I feel safest when I'm with the group. And often I find people marry people of differing instincts so that once again, we can find that expansiveness in each other. I know that's what Wes and I did when we first met too. We found somebody who differed there so that we could help each other.
Okay, so I feel like even those descriptions, I'm having a hard time kind of wrapping around. So maybe it
Sure.
would be helpful to describe that with actual numbers. So go ahead and do it for
Yeah.
Alex and I. I identify with a 2, a social 2,
Okay.
which I don't know if that
Yeah.
social 2 is wrapped up
Yeah.
in those instincts.
Yep.
And Alex identifies with a 6. Alex, do you know what
Okay.
type 6?
What
Well,
instinct?
I know that I'm a phobic 6. Does
Okay,
that
that's
Okay.
does
helpful.
that
Yeah, that's usually the self-preserving 6.
hmm
So
Yeah.
could be the social, but you probably like both of those.
hmm
Do you feel like, and I'll do a little bit of I love how we're getting in action here.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you are more like, I love my introvert time and I also just love my people. I know my people, they're my safe people in my home more, and I need my own time to myself more. And I tend to trust others sometimes even more than myself. Or do you feel like, no, I trust myself more. And or are you like, oh my gosh, I love group process and like I feel so close to the people in my community, and that's where I find my safety. Any of those speak to you?
Well, all of them, but I would say the
Okay.
first is probably stronger.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. A little bit more self-preserving.
Mhm.
There's some
Mhm.
trust within yourself and keeping to your, your habits and the things that make you feel safe on the internal level. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So I guess right here, we just would look at both of you and say, paired with your 6, that creates her already as a 6. She's the befriender. She's a loyal person. So Alex is going to want to find people who make her feel really, really safe. She's not going to need as many deep, close friendships with everybody out there. She's going to need a few. And she's going to really, really hold those relationships high, but also need time to herself. And in a relationship where this gets interesting, because I'm sort of just parroting back what she said so far, but in a relationship where that gets interesting is that she comes to this space of needing to communicate that to her spouse, that how I thrive and feel safe is to make sure that we keep a very trusted circle, that we don't go too crazy out there in the world, that we come back to our nest and replenish before we give out again. That makes me feel replenished. And that makes me as a 6 be able to trust more, feel less fearful. Does that fit with you?
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm also thinking about my spouse, and I don't feel like he's not Mr. Social as far
Okay.
as so we don't have to have those conversations at times. But
oh, that's neat. That's neat. I heard somebody say that recently. They said, I think it's so important to pick somebody of your same instinct. And as you know, we all do it differently, but that is really a cool thing you share, is that part. He probably has a bit of that too. So he's like, oh yeah, we kind of match there, that I also like to come within at home. And that's not an area where you have as much conflict.
correct.
Oh, cool.
Okay, now
Yeah,
that is not true of my spouse and myself.
okay. So you're more like us. You're more social, and what's your spouse more?
So he identifies with a 1.
Okay. Okay.
And I don't know what the the instinct necessarily descriptors of the 1 are, but I don't know. What are they?
Well, it would be the self-preserving one, would be more of the classic perfectionist who wants to go within and improve themselves. And then the sexual one would be more like, I love to improve my spouse and just keep helping them to be better and better. And then the social one would be the one to say, I've got to change the whole world. And I'm going to do that with everybody, including my spouse and me. And so I love that you are trying to figure out and assess where he's at as you think about you being the social 2 who has got a lot of energy. And here you're in the podcasting frame. That's a beautiful place for you as a social 2, because you can help the whole world. So I love that. But do you have a sense for you guys as a dynamic now that I say that?
Yeah. So I'm very outward facing, and he would definitely fall into the self-preserving one.
Okay.
So he doesn't try and change me. He tries to change
Yeah.
himself.
Okay. Yes, he would much more be the self-preserving one. And that's an important distinction for your marriage, to be able to say, like, this means so much to him. It makes him feel safe when he's got the wellness and the safety, and he's got the security, and he can make sure all the things in the home and in our relationship and our finances and the time we spend and the way we treat our bodies, like that, those are all very important to self-preserving ones. And so that's good for the spouse to not try to change and shift who our partner is, but to try to support that, and then very slowly help each other to expand. And over the years, you make him a bit more social, and he makes you a bit more conscientious in that way. And then, of course, the same thing is true for Alex, in that she and her husband together, with their secure base of self-preserving, they can branch out to the one-to-one together, and they can branch out to the world together. So we can all make these moves, but you can imagine how when couples come in for their work, sometimes these are so off that they're causing divorce, affairs, because they're like, they never go out with me. They don't ever look at the budget. These are terrifying experiences, because these are core issues in our brainstem that we can't really help. So we have to try to work with each other's instincts. And I think knowing them really adds to our understanding, whether we're using the Enneagram or not. But it's just a part of the Enneagram, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does make sense. So what else do you see as couples come in? What is helpful as far as using the Enneagram?
I think that they come in without compassion for each other. They come in with a sense of that fundamental attribution error that most people have in marriage, which is I'm a little bit healthier than they are. And it's just this human error that we all have and we bring in, and like they have more trauma, or I have more trauma, but I handle it better. They have more trauma that they don't work on. And so we attribute external factors to their stuff, like they're just not as good. And then for ours, we're like, oh, internally, it's because I had this bad day or I was tired when I was mean. But when they do it, it's because they're bad. So it's sort of something everyone has to watch out for. And when we learn the Enneagram, we really get to look at our stuff too. And that's why it's so ironic that some people don't like it, because it's actually a tool that helps people to do self-work. And it's gracious if you are with a practitioner who is grace-filled and Christ-filled versus somebody who's punitive. It's an opportunity to say, oh, when I'm not at my best, this is a vice I struggle with. Now I can relate with my spouse and their vice. But we also can approach our virtues now that we can isolate, okay, I know I struggle with gluttony, for instance. Now I can approach sobriety. And that's mine. I'm a type 7. And so when I'm not as healthy, I could be doing too much. But when I'm healthy, I'm not eating 24/7. I'm self-soothing with healthy things. And it might not be eating. It might be something like drugs, alcohol. It could be busyness. It could be anything that you're doing too extreme. Could be exercising, which is what I did a lot of in my early 20s. And whatever we're doing it to excess. And then we kind of hit this existential crash around, most of us can remember around age 30, sort of what we were doing was no longer working for us. And so when we do our Enneagram work, it gives us this opportunity to come back in with some grace to ourselves and our spouses and say, you know what, let's try to work on our vices and even acknowledge that we have them, just as our spouse does. And some of us get into therapy in those years, or just start doing some good self-reflective work, listening to podcasts like yours. So thank you guys for helping us all to do that.
So how do the triads play in? So we've got head, heart, and gut. Again, I know we're using a lot of internal terminology. Yeah. So if people aren't familiar with these, do go and listen to that other episode and then come back, or, whatever you need to, or go listen to some of your episodes on your podcast. But help us with the triads and how that plays into marriage dynamics.
Well, I love it because the Enneagram's robust, we can think of, there's a lot of groupings of 3 or triads. That's all she's really saying when Krista says triads, is these groups of 3. And the main one she's referring to is called our centers of intelligence. And in the past, people only gave thinkers credit for intelligence. It was, there's only one way. If you're not good on standardized tests, then you're dumb. And that's ridiculous. There's so many other forms of intelligence, as we're thankfully more learning and modern times. And so we're learning there's a heart intelligence, people that have that intuitive knowing, like Krista, that you have this type 2 ability to sense what other people are feeling and to touch that and to, speak to their hearts and bring change that way. And then we have the head knowing that Alex and I would say that that's maybe our favorite wheelhouse. And then we also have that body or gut knowing, and different types fall into different triads. And the 2, 3, and 4 fall into that heart space I mentioned. The 5s, 6s, and 7s fall into the thinking space or the head types. And then we have the 8, 9s, and 1s who are more concerned with justice knowing, a right and wrong knowing, and a gut knowing. My husband's that, and so is yours, Krista, you mentioned. And they just feel it. They know it in their gut when something is right. And so that's how they approach the world, is through the arms of justice and doing that. So we each come in with a different gift. Sometimes in marriage, we marry somebody who either shares that or but has a different presentation with it, or more often we marry somebody outside of our triad here, our center of intelligence. And then we're gifted, and our children are gifted, our community is gifted with this other form of intelligence too. But it takes some time getting used to that, because we each, once again, have our own language for seeing the world. So it's very helpful to know that and to say that mine's not better or worse than theirs. This is just giving us each a chance to learn from each other. It takes time.
So when you say the center of intelligence, and the way and tell me if I'm wrong, because I could be wrong on this, but I've always interpreted that as this is how I lead in the world. And this is how I lead with how I move through the world. So for me, for example, I'm going to walk into a room and I'm going to immediately take the pulse of everyone around me. Like that is, I'm not up here thinking, I'm actually just feeling pulse of, walking in and getting a feel for what's happening. So it's how I lead. Is that a good descriptor or no?
You said it really well. Yep. It's how you lead. It's how you read a room. It's how you really carry the way you see and perceive things, because it's your center of intelligence, and intelligence is our way of knowing. So that is what you do, and that is what you know. And it doesn't mean we can't learn from each other and begin a heart, mind, body knowing, and even add in our spiritual lens too. But it does mean that this is our superpower. And so that's the good you can do in the world, is to do that and make everyone in that room comfortable. I love that.
Well, okay, but this is interesting. This is where I want to get really practical and I'm just going to use my husband and I as an example. So with him being more in that one space, and it's interesting to hear you talk about justice, because that very much is part of his gut triad.
Yeah.
But even when we talk about things, he will go up here and want to talk more about the ideas and talk about, and I'm always like, bring it down to the heart. I don't really care about like what you think about the idea. I want to know how it's applying to you in your life and your heart. Whereas he would be so excited for me to join him in talking about the higher idea in that moment. Like we have these conversations. So this is where rubber meets the road. Types wanting to communicate in a certain way. So how do we find that, and how do we learn to identify it? Because I've done a lot of work, and so I can give language to that, but I haven't always been able to give language to that. And I'm sure many people can't. And I'm just speaking about our two types. There's however 40, whatever you said, type pairings. And so how do they even find language to how they want to communicate? Because that's a huge part of our relationship.
Yeah, and it's a great question. And I think this is why the Enneagram is a great tool for couples in distress, because you just named what everyone walks through when we have these moments where we're having this conflict or lack of compatibility. And that's all conflict really is. So it's this moment where you say, how can I meet him if I'm differently wired? It happens. It's real. And I would say that what we know about type twos is sometimes type twos and type ones, actually, both you and him, can both be in their stance work, which is yet one another triad of the Enneagram. They can both be thinking inhibited. And so critical thinking is excellent for both of you. And a walk and talk can get you thinking differently because you're moving and there's a different dynamic than just sitting and reflecting and feeling each other's feelings. Other things for twos, Suzanne Stabile, who you had on before, she does a lot of stance work in the Enneagram. And she says that just getting up in the morning and having time with the Holy Spirit before the beginning of the day is the way that she can finally connect with her mind versus feeling everybody's feelings. And I have a good friend that's the same way, who's a two, who does that same thing. And so finding your practices, another person mentioned doing their own kind of driving in the car and talking out loud to connect with their thinking. And it isn't that twos aren't thinking, it's that they're thinking relationally. And so for you to do critical mental thinking is possible, but you have to really be intentional with that and find your best routes. And your husband, he's thinking inhibited, but his thinking more goes towards these issues of right and wrong and injustices most of the time. And that's not giving him as expansive thinking as he could have too in the heart space about the relationship. So that's one thing you guys can do, is start walk and talk, start figuring out and just being curious versus condemning, like what would give us some traction for our thinking to be a bit broader. Now, another tool that I think every listener could benefit from within the Enneagram framework, because that can be a bit, that's a lot that I just said there. There's one that's even a bit easier. We use it for conflict specifically. And it's that twos are positivity types and ones fall into logical competency group. And so hang in with me here when I say, if you know that, you can start to say to yourself, if I want to get through to my husband, I have to come at him with logic and competency versus just positivity, because twos carry themselves lightly. And I see you laughing there. So does that fit?
Yeah, I'm definitely the cheerleader. Rah, rah, let's go. And he definitely wants the logic, competency.
Correct.
Yep.
Yes. The good
So
news is, yeah, please. Yeah.
can you expand on that? Like, what types are there other?
Yeah. I was hoping we could talk about this
Okay.
because types 2, 7, and 9 are positivity types. So as you mentioned, they like to keep it light. Doesn't mean they don't blow a head gasket sometimes too, but they would love to just think in ideals, comfort, fun, lightness, love. And then we have our 1s, 3s, and 5s that are much more likely to be okay to just be completely logical and linear in a conflict and use the genetic fallacy that I mentioned earlier. And then we have the last group, which is our emotional reactivity and passion group, which is our 4s, 6s, and 8s. They don't mind to bring in the deeper, more passionate care when they're in a spousal conversation, because they know I'm willing to put my cards on the table. I love you. There's big things at stake here if we don't care for one another. So they don't mind showing and putting it out there how they really feel, and they're very passionate. Now, as we can imagine, the best is when we can combine positivity. It's also good for our brains to be very positive. That's a good thing. To have that depth, that passion, that reactivity, and to try to maintain logic. When couples start to do all three of these things, which is hard, you got to start with one and then broaden out to 2 and 3. They start to argue in ways that allow them to get traction. They start to respect each other, start to bring in enough positivity and yet care. They're not just logical, not just foolishly optimistic, and they're not just passionate without any lens. So it's a neat thing to know these conflict triads, and I'm glad you asked.
So that's what these are called, is conflict triads.
Yes, the specific name is the harmonic group, if anyone wanted to look it up. But this is part of Enneagram, like you said, 2.0, is just knowing how you can work through conflicts with the Enneagram. And this is a very helpful tool.
So, like Alex, how do you experience that in your sector?
Yeah. So my husband and I then are both in the passion.
Okay.
So he identifies as a 4.
Okay.
And I am thinking that we've got a lot of passion when we have conflict, and maybe we derail a little bit.
Yeah.
Because we aren't bringing in some of that logic or that lightness.
Yes.
And so it can burn hot fast.
Correct.
As far as like, it's just like things just turn and we're like, okay, we're in argument mode. And so that makes sense to me that would be true.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that 4s, 6s, and 8s are in that same category. That's interesting to me. Why? Why are they in that same category?
I don't know why the late David Daniels, put them together, but I do know that it's very scientific in the sense that it works, and when things work over and over and again, that's what we call science. When they keep showing up consistently with reason, it's neat because you're like, okay, now I get it. We're both reactive. And if we really wanted to, dissect it more, we could say perhaps where they sit on the personality spectrum, or we could say 4s are very passionate, even though they're creative and artists, and they sit in melancholy and depth a lot. And 6s are very passionate because they're security oriented and they don't want to lose these deep, loyal responses. And then we already heard 8s are the protectors with this big energy. So all three of these types care very deeply and show up so passionately. But I love how you just said we could add in some lightness and some logic, Alex. Now, what I always have to help couples with, and I talk about this, is it's hard when you're growing past your spouse and doing the learning quickly. I just had that today already in session, that we have to bring our spouses gently with us and let them know the work we're doing so they don't feel left out. So next time they have a spat, you might start acting lighter or more logically, and they're like, what are you doing? This makes me feel even more terrified. But you could say, something I want to do next time we have this discussion, or even in the middle of it, is let's take a moment to take a deep breath, or you know what, we got so over the top. Let's laugh about how ridiculous this all is and then keep talking. And let's bring in something positive that we love about each other in this moment. Like any of these could be things, as long as you tell your spouse, hey, I want to learn and grow with you, it'll be really good for you both.
Yeah, because when we resolve things is usually when we bring in one of those, but it's later.
Yeah.
And maybe we
Yeah.
don't need to go through all that
Yeah.
pain
Yeah.
and conflict and we can bring it in
Mhm.
earlier in the process.
Yeah. Yeah. At least sometimes. Maybe
Yeah.
sometimes you really do need to have those two passionate perspectives, because it really matters and it's huge. But I love it. I love how you said, maybe not all the time, though. Maybe we could bring in some of these others. That's awesome, Alex.
So how do we get better? I mean, if that's not our type, so
Yeah.
maybe there's two people in this different camps, or maybe like
Mhm.
Alex and Derek, they're in the same camp. But
Mhm.
how do you exercise muscles that don't come naturally to you, especially
Mhm.
when you're feeling reactive and emotional? Because we tend to just default.
Mm. Well, general marriage tools help us here as well. And these are the tools that remind us of how to self-soothe in an argument. So, what we have to remember is that when we are not feeling regulated and our heartbeat goes past 100 beats a minute, which often can happen when we're in that state, we allow a breath. We just take a moment and we pause and we allow a breath versus just reacting immediately. Another thing we could do is, once again, the walk and talk I mentioned is extremely good for couples typically when they're in a conflict, because you're no longer staring down the barrels of each other's eyes and you're
Mhm.
allowing for some neutral, just, okay, we love each other. We're on a walk. We're getting some of that angst out. Another skill that really helps people sometimes is taking a moment to go into a state of rest where you allow yourselves a short break. Now, if you take a break because you're like, this is hard, I see that we're different, I want to make a move toward you on whatever topic we're discussing. Maybe one wants to go here for a vacation, one wants to see this in-law or do something that just makes the other one feel that negative arousal. We just say, you know what, I want to stay here with you. I see that we're different. No, none of us is a hero or a villain. It's important language to use. But now we can just, let me take 20 minutes. And here's the key, a term of endearment in that 20-minute break. I love you. I'm not going anywhere, or I am going somewhere, but I'll be back. I'm just heading off to the store briefly. Or I know it's nighttime, we're going to bed, but I want to pick this back up on Thursday, when we always have our morning chat. There's a security in knowing I'm not abandoning, but it's really hard and it's heavy hitting for me to make some changes now. So I had to say that to my spouse yesterday. And I just said, hey, this is a big day for me. I want to talk to you about that in person. And then we were able to carry on the rest of our text chat during work hours with lightness and logic, because that's what we do best. But it was like, you're hitting, for me and him, our blind spot is the emotional that you and your husband have, Alex. So I wanted to say, like, I'm going to need some emotion around this. It was fairly small, but it was like big enough, just big enough to need that. So I was like, I'm going to talk to you later, but I love you and it's worth my time. Whereas I think the old Krista, and maybe either Krista, we're so positive, we might have just kept it light and not really shared our deeper feelings. So it's kind of learning for yourself, like you and your spouse are better when you give big things time and actually do pursue the conflict in these helpful ways.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that feels really wise. Just feels like wisdom to
Mm.
me.
Mm.
So what happens if, I mean, Krista, there are just certain things in other people's personality types that just drives you crazy. I mean,
Mm.
bonkers. And you're
Mm.
just like, that is driving me crazy and it's making me not like you. I mean, that really is bottom
Yes, it's
line. It's how we
real. Yeah. Yeah.
so, I mean, what do we do when we're faced with that? Because I know a lot of people who who have trusted me enough to say,
Mhm.
I don't like that about him. I don't like him right
Yeah.
now. What do you
Yeah.
say to those people?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I love your questions, you guys. They're very deep. And I feel like it goes back to one of my favorite Tolkien lines, where there's life, there's hope. And
Mm,
I think that we have to have hope for every single person who's alive, to remember that God has a reason for them to be here, and a way that we can allow ourselves to perhaps tarry with them or tolerate them more is to try to remember the pain point of their Enneagram, or if we don't know Enneagram, just some of their backstory that we may be privileged to know. This person has a lot of very severe trauma that I don't understand. Everyone has their own genome, and we're learning now even about hereditary traits where we have epigenetics. So it's just allowing ourselves to understand that we don't know everything. We're not the judge. God knows their story better than us. And that can be the beginning of our forgiveness practice, along with the Lord's Prayer. But to really just allow ourselves to say, Lord, they're troublesome to me. I'm allowed to lament. And He does want that closeness with you. And then to be able to say, I'm holding up gratitude for the good you've given me, also knowing that I don't know their whole story and I'm not them, and that must have pains that I don't understand. I release them to you. And then from there, you can allow yourself a space of how can I now relate with them? Now, some people we seem to have in our lives almost as a thorn in our side, that they're going to be part of our lives. So to try to address sometimes things directly when we think they're going to be in my life and they're going to bring their trauma to me, now we have to learn to set boundaries with that person. But sometimes they're not necessarily in our lives, and we don't have to keep inviting in people that derail and dysregulate us. But I think honestly, even just like having children is very dysregulating. So sometimes we do have to be with people who dysregulate us. We just have to learn to self-soothe, take deep breaths, spend time with the Lord, and lament, like I said.
So if that person is your spouse, or you're thinking, this is a trait that it nags at me, or I can't quite get past it. How do you guide people through that?
Well, I start with the process I mentioned to you. I call that my refresh prayer cycle. And I really do give them that space to lament who their spouse isn't. That's really important, because we first join and we're shiny and we're happy and we love everything about them. And then we realize, oh, there's things about other personality types that I maybe would have liked better, or do like better in this moment, at least. And to realize that there will be ebb and flow and seasons where they're carrying us and we're carrying them. And it looks different across every season. I know my mom carried my dad most of their marriage, and then she had a stroke. And in the last 12 years, my dad carried her heroically as no one had ever seen. And people said at my mom's funeral, I've never seen a husband love their wife so much. And I was just like, oh my gosh, like what a transformation. And so to watch people across many seasons, to know like, I'm allowed to lament. This is hard. They're not in a healthy space. And setting our boundaries, even with them. God loves us more than our marriage certificate. So making sure we're safe and that we're held and that we get good self-care in times when they're not healthy. And then I think also, as I said, to enter into some healthy frames of conflict, to be able to say, you know what, like we need some space to work on some of this. We obviously disagree about this. Let's try to talk about it with some lightness, with some logic, with some passion, even if we need to do that with a third party. But even if they say, I don't want to, I think it's important that we do our work and we discover what we need to do to set our boundaries, because nobody wants to go through life in a constant state of dysregulation. And I don't think that God wants that for us either.
Yeah, and the healthier we get within ourselves, then the healthier we rise the level around us.
Yes.
And it's really true. So the healthier we are raising the bar, and hopefully people start to meet that. So I love that comment.
Yes.
Okay, so as we close today, we are really just scratching the surface, and I'm feeling that right now. I'm just feeling like, oh, we need Krista on here for like 3 episodes in a row. But as we look at rising to meet the opportunities and challenges in this season of our marriages, how would you encourage people?
I would encourage you to follow the simple framework I mentioned of your instincts, because these are the deepest level. So I would allow yourself safety building, and whatever that looks like for you. Maybe it looks like making your home look sweeter and just getting a candle and a plant. Or for somebody else, it's really doing their daily walk and just allowing themselves to go for that walk and have a devotional and a time of journaling. Whatever makes you feel safe with the Lord, with your family, that is where you want to start, so that you're not personally dysregulated. And then moving from from there to that one-to-one dynamic. How can we come back if we're in this hard season of marriage? How can we come back to attracting and wooing each other, even if just in a small way, to say to each other, what's one thing I can do that would be more attractive to you? What's something that you would like to, make things a little different so that we could have some adventure back again? Just coming back to that fun instinct too, which we often lose as we get into these middle years of marriage that are so long. And we think dating is only for young, and it doesn't even have to be date. It could literally be like, I love when you wear red lipstick, or I love when you wear that cologne. Just bringing that back as a very early step. And then lastly, social, knowing how are we shining individually and together in the world, and what's one small way we could do that, or even just let's acknowledge one way we're already doing that. A lot of people are raising teenagers or young adults, and it's so important to be able to say, like, look what we did, look back on what we did and celebrate that, and look what we're doing now. Maybe I mentor somebody, maybe you're a teacher, whatever your vocation is, podcaster, like just stopping to pause and praise for the social output that you do have together. And I think that most relationships, everything's built on what we're not, but to see what we are already doing well and to just shore ourselves up with safety just feels really right to me.
Yeah, that does feel right. It feels good, and it feels like a challenge.
Yeah. Yes. Because we're so negatively wired as humans to look for problems, and just to be like, here's what I love about us. That's refreshing for your marriage. Here's what I love about you. This is sexy, or this makes me feel safe. So just working on those instincts is a great place for people to start. And like you said, Krista, it doesn't even take your spouse to do that. It just takes you being a bit more intentional and choosing one thing from this episode to just take with you.
I love what you said, to focus on what you are together instead of what you're not. That's a great quote. That is such a good quote. Well, Krista, thank you. I know, I mean, people can just, we're going to link to all of your resources and your podcast and your book. And we are excited for people to dive further into this with you. But thank you so much for your coming on today and just your deep insights. It's been really beautiful.
Oh, I'm so honored to be here with you ladies on your amazing show. So thank you so much for the work you're doing and for having me.
Bye, Krista.
Bye.